Today we're going to be talking about terrestrial biomes. And a biome is an area of land or water, and it's all of the flora and fauna. So that means all of the plants, all of the animals in that given community. And so when we're talking about a terrestrial biome, we're talking about on land. Terrestrial is referring to being on land. So there's lots of different terrestrial biomes. We're going to cover some of the major ones today and look at what animals occupy them, and really what's going to determine what animals are able to occupy a biome is the vegetation that's there. And obviously the vegetation is going to be dependent on what type of climatic conditions we find in those biomes. So whether there's a lot of rain, whether there's a little rain, average yearly rainfall, climate in general, all of those are going to play a role in determining what type of vegetation and then therefore what type of animals we see in these areas. So each major biome is going to have groups of animals and groups of plants that they're going to be found in that biome, and they're not going to be found in other types of biomes. Some of them can cross over, but for the majority of them, animals stick to one type of biome, and that's really the only place that we see them. And these biomes can show up in different places throughout the world. It doesn't necessarily have to be in one part of the world where you find one biome and you can't find it in another part of the world. Because again, if the conditions are similar, it may not be an identical, for example, a desert, right? We have different types of deserts throughout the world, but the deserts are characterized by the lack of water. And so even though you may have one desert in one continent, it doesn't mean you can't have a desert in another continent. So the first biome we want to talk about today are called savannas. Savannas are found in areas where they have very little rainfall and it's warm year-round. So obviously areas that have cold winters, you're not going to have savannas, because if you have the cold winter, then it's going to be a different type of biome. So these savannas are going to be mostly covered with grass, and there's going to be a few trees that are scattered about, but it's definitely not anything like a forest or anything like that. Savannas are characterized by poor soil and lack of moisture. So because it's in an area where it's warm, and then you combine that with very little rain, that's what's going to inhibit the growth of trees. You don't have a lot of nutrients in the soil to feed the trees, and you don't have a lot of water for the trees to grow very large, right? Because anytime you're going to have trees that are going to grow and get to a decent amount of size, you're going to have water for that to happen. So in savannas, oftentimes you have frequent fires because the area gets dry, the grass gets dry, and then you have like a lightning strike or something like that. And so that prevents a lot of the trees from growing too large as well. And so in these savannas, you're going to find, this is the type of environment or the type of biome where you're going to find things like lions, a rhinoceros, giraffe. So you think about the African savanna, one of the most prominent savannas in the world, and that's what you're going to find there. You're going to find a lot of the animals, the animals you go to the zoo to look for, the animals you want to see at the zoo, a lot of them come from the savanna. And it's those big expanses of dry area with few grasses. So these areas are adapted specifically to long periods of drought. They don't get a lot of rain, and so the plants there and the animals there have kind of learned to deal with that. The animals are going to flock to watering holes. So watering holes in these savannas is an area where you can see a big diversity of the animals in that area. If you go to the watering hole at the right time, you're going to find lions next to elephants and water buffalo and crocodiles in the water, and just the whole, like I said, diversity of all of these species coming together, because it's one of the few places there where you can have water, right? You don't have streams or rivers flowing through the savanna. You don't have large lakes. So you just have these watering holes that show up when the rains do come. And so lots of organisms congregate there. The next biome we want to discuss are temperate grasslands. They're similar to savanna in the fact that they are a lot of expansive grasslands with very few trees. However, the difference between these and the savanna is these are going to be found in areas that do have cold winter temperatures. So the savanna, it's always staying warm. In these temperate grasslands, you're going to have the winter seasons. So they have an average amount of rainfall, but again, you're not going to see as many trees as you would in a forest, because You have a lot of fires, again, because it gets dry in the summer and the lightning strike can cause a fire. Also, you have a lot of grazing animals like bison and things like that. And so they're going to inhibit the growth of trees as well because they're eating up all the grasses. And sometimes while eating the grasses, they'll eat tree saplings and things like that just by accident. So you don't have a lot of tree growth in these areas, again, limited by heavy grazing and not as much water as you would need. So in addition to bison, you're also going to find longhorn, the cows there in these areas. A lot of times, we don't think about them being wild, but they are a wild animal. There's just a lot of them are kept in captivity and things like that. So in North America, you're going to find wild horses. In Asia, this is where you would find wild sheep. So a lot of these are animals we think of as domesticated animals and animals that are kept in farms. But, those animals that are kept in farms, they had to come from somewhere, and they come from these temperate grasslands. A lot of birds are found in the grasslands. They nest on the ground. And so you find a lot of different bird species there. You're going to find like grouse and quail, those types of birds. Also, you're going to find animals burrowing a lot. So you're going to find like field mice, you're going to find rabbits, you're going to find prairie dogs, those types of animals. And they're burrowing to protect themselves, shelter from storms and things like that, and also to hide from predators, right? Because with all the diversity that you're going to have here, you're going to have a lot of predators. So you're going to have foxes, and you're going to have coyotes, and you're going to have other animals patrolling these areas looking for these small mammals and small birds. The soil here is going to be pretty rich, and so what sometimes unfortunately happens, or just kind of what has to happen, is a lot of times these temperate grasslands are converted into agricultural areas. So the soil there is already good because it receives rainfall, and because you have a lot of turnover from the biomass, just the constant recycling of grasses dying and then being decomposed and putting nutrients back into the soil and that sort of thing. Plus, you don't have to go in and cut down a lot of trees, right? So in a forest, you have to remove all the trees and then get rid of all the roots, and then you can farm it. But with a grassland, it's really just simple as burning off the grass, and then you can start farming on that. So in addition to all those animals, the grasslands are going to be loaded with a lot of different annelids, so our worm family, and a lot of arthropods, just insects and bugs everywhere. Again, it's an enormous diversity, and whenever you have diversity, that's going to attract other groups. So by having a lot of bugs, that's going to attract a lot of birds and small mammals. The birds and small mammals are going to attract larger predators, and just gives you more diversity within your biome. Next, we move from the temperate grassland to a temperate woodland, sometimes shrubland, sometimes even called a chaparral. Okay. So these regions are characterized by dense, spiny shrubs with evergreen leaves. So they're not your typical big tree forest that you would expect, but they're just more kind of a temperate, like I said, it's a lot of times what happens is a grassland will kind of fade into a woodland or vice versa. So these two biomes will kind of connect to one another. So these plants, a lot of spiny shrubs, evergreen trees. The animals that tend to live here, we're going to find deer, a lot of fruit-eating birds, seed-eating rodents, lizards, snakes. So similar to what you would find in the grassland, but it's going to vary just a little bit different because of they do have the added protection of the shrub and the evergreen trees. The next biome, as we move up into our northern locations around the globe, would be the tundra. The tundra is where things get a little bit colder, quite a bit colder in most areas. They're going to be characterized by what is called permafrost. Permafrost is when the soil itself is frozen. So it's continually frozen. That top layer, top few inches will thaw out in summer. And so because of that, you can have plants that do grow, but they're going to die off very quickly. So they may take root in the springtime whenever that ground is thawed out enough. But as soon as fall returns and those temperatures drop and it refreezes, a plant can't grow in frozen soil. And so there's a very, very short growing season in these tundra areas. There are really cold temperatures and high winds in the winter, so very short growing seasons. Also, that equates to nutrient poor soil. You don't have very much growth, so you don't have very much death, so there's not a lot of recycling going on, so there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil. Vegetation is pretty limited. You've got some dwarf shrubs, grasses, mosses, and lichens are prominent in the tundras. All of the animals there are going to have some type of thick insulation. So these would include like oxen and caribou, as well as your smaller rodents like Arctic foxes and your predators like wolves and things like that. So many of the animals are migratory. So they are going to leave these areas when it gets really cold because there's simply not a whole lot left there. So a lot of your birds are obviously going to fly south. A lot of the other animals are going to try to get to somewhere else where there's food, because if you are in an area and you're trying to survive and there's no food, a good solution to that is to go somewhere where there is food. So like I said, a lot of the birds are going to get out of there when the weather gets cold. But some of those animals, they're going to stay there and they're going to continue to just kind of tough it out through the winter and wait for spring to come. And then one more group of biomes are the deserts, terrestrial biomes that we find. Deserts are the driest of the terrestrial biomes. They are characterized by really small amounts of rain. All of the plants there are adapted to it. So the deserts are where we're going to find our cacti. They are specifically formulated and specifically built to survive off very small amounts of rain. The cycle of growth and reproduction is all built around the rainfall. So they do have some rainy seasons, but it's nothing like you would experience in a normal location. For deserts, the rain's going to come and go. It's going to come and it's going to be very heavy, and then the rain will be gone. The area may not see rain for several weeks, if not months. So most plants have a waxy coating that prevents water loss. So it just kind of helps keep that water inside. So there's not going to be a lot of transpiration going on. Transpiration is where, plants are losing water through their leaves. Most of the organisms, the plants that we see in deserts don't have leaves for that reason, right? So when you think about a cactus, you think about that waxy coating, it's going to try to trap all that water inside to make sure it can't get out. Most of these plants are water storing, what we call a succulent, which is succulents, the whole group of cacti and those types of things. Again, depending on the type of deserts, you may have the large saguaro cactus, or you may have very small to low to the ground cacti. It just kind of really depends on what area of the world you're in. Some deserts receive more rain than others, and so again, that's going to dictate what type of vegetation you have. They produce a massive amount of seeds that remain dormant until a heavy rainfall. So a lot of these cacti are just going to produce seeds. They're going to hit the ground and they're just going to stay there and nothing's going to happen. Then when the rain comes, they activate and then they grow and take seed. And those saguaro cactus, they grow very, very slowly. If you're looking at a saguaro cactus that's 20 or 30 feet tall, it's probably 50 years old or more, because it's just the growing seasons are very, very small. It may take 5 or 6 years to get a plant that's 5 or 6 inches tall. It's just because the conditions aren't right for them to grow. So when you see one that, if you're looking at a really tall one, you may be looking at something that's 100 years old. So the animals there, they are adapted to extreme drought and extreme temperatures. So a lot of them are nocturnal, meaning they only come out at night. That's how they beat the heat. Rather than battling the heat throughout the day, they simply stay in underground or in their burrow out of the sun, and then they become active at night. So they're adapted to that with their good hearing, a little bit better night vision, and just adapted to move around at night and to be active then. And then most of the animals there are going to feed on seed, or they're going to be eating the seed eaters. So it's a pretty tight network there in the deserts. And that covers all of our terrestrial biomes. I'll see you next time.